Vietnam, 1966. A rice paddy somewhere in the Mekong Delta. The jungle is silent in the way that means it isn't. 12 American soldiers are sitting inside a metal box, moving through water that would swallow a truck, through terrain that would stop almost any other vehicle on the planet. The box is aluminum. It floats. It moves at highway speed on land and swims rivers without stopping. It carries a machine gun on top and a squad of infantry inside, and it has already changed the way armies think about moving men into battle. It costs less than a sports car. It weighs less than 4 elephants. And 60 years after it first rolled off the assembly line, it is still in active service in over 50 countries. This is the M113, the most successful armored personnel carrier in history. A machine so simple, so adaptable, and so relentlessly useful that the armies of the world simply cannot stop using it, no matter how many times someone announces it's obsolete. How did a boxy aluminum rectangle become the backbone of armored infantry for 6 decades? And why, in an era of billion-dollar vehicles, does the M113 keep showing up on every battlefield on Earth? Stay with me. To understand why the M113 exists, you have to understand the problem it was built to solve, and how badly that problem was being handled before it arrived. World War II established one brutal truth about infantry on the modern battlefield. Walking gets you killed. The open ground of Europe, the islands of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, everywhere, soldiers moving on foot were exposed to artillery, to aircraft, to machine guns, to everything the industrial age could throw at a human body. The answer, in theory, was mechanization. Put the infantry in vehicles, move them fast, protect them from small arms, get them to the fight before the fight comes to them. The vehicles that existed to do this job in the late 1940s and early 1950s were inadequate. Half-tracks left over from World War II were open-topped, vulnerable and aging. The M75 and M59 armored personnel carriers that followed were better, armored, enclosed, but they were heavy, expensive, slow and incapable of crossing water without bridging equipment. In a world where armies expected to fight across the rivers and canals of Central Europe, a vehicle that stopped at every waterway was a serious tactical problem. The army needed something that could do everything. Fast enough to keep up with tanks, light enough to be airlifted, cheap enough to buy in large numbers, simple enough for any mechanic to fix, and capable of swimming, not with special preparation, not with a snorkel kit, just swimming naturally as part of what it was. The answer came from Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, a company better known for making agricultural equipment than weapons of war. And that background, it turned out, was exactly the right preparation for what they were about to build. The engineers at FMC who designed the M113 made a series of choices that looked radical at the time and turned out to be exactly right. Aluminum armor, not steel, aluminum. The reaction from the military establishment was predictable. Aluminum is for airplanes, not tanks. It's soft, it'll melt, it'll fail. The engineers held their ground. Aluminum armor, at the right thickness and alloy, provided protection equivalent to much thicker steel while saving enormous amounts of weight. The M113's aluminum hull weighed significantly less than a comparable steel vehicle would have, and that weight saving was what made everything else possible. The swimming, the airlift, the speed. The aluminum also had an unexpected property that crews in Vietnam would come to appreciate deeply. It didn't produce the lethal spalling that steel did when penetrated. A steel vehicle hit by a bullet or fragment sends razor-sharp shards of metal flying around the interior. Aluminum tended to deform rather than shatter. Not invulnerable, nothing is, but different in ways that sometimes made the difference between a crew that survived a hit and one that didn't. The layout was brutally simple: engine in front, driver at the front left, commander's hatch at the top with a .50 caliber machine gun, rear ramp that dropped down to let infantry dismount quickly, interior space for 11 soldiers plus the driver. No frills, no complexity, nothing that didn't need to be there. The tracks were designed to propel the vehicle in water without modification. No preparation required. Drive into a river, keep moving, come out the other side. The M113 was amphibious the way a duck is amphibious, naturally, automatically, without drama. The engine, initially a Chrysler 75M gasoline engine, later upgraded to a Detroit diesel in the A1 variant, was reliable, accessible, and easy to work on. A trained mechanic could perform most maintenance in the field with basic tools. In a war zone 10,000 miles from the nearest depot, that matters more than almost anything else. Let's talk about what the M113 was when it entered service in 1960. Because the specifications, dry as they are, tell a story. 11 tons. For comparison, the M59 it replaced weighed around 19 tons. The M113 was lighter by nearly half, which is not an incremental improvement. That is a different philosophy made physical. Maximum road speed, around 67 kilometers per hour. Water speed, around 5.8 kilometers per hour. Range, approximately 480 kilometers. Armor, aluminum alloy providing protection against small arms fire and shell fragments. The .50 caliber M2HB machine gun on the commander's hatch gave it a bite that light vehicles typically lacked. Crew of 2, driver and commander, plus 11 infantry. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in any weather, in any terrain, with a vehicle that could be maintained by the people who depended on it. The dimensions were compact enough that the M113 could be transported inside a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. One plane, one vehicle. That single fact transformed the tactical possibilities for any army that operated the M113. Rapid deployment wasn't just a concept anymore. You could fly your armored infantry to a crisis and have them operational within hours of landing. And the price? The M113 originally cost around $23,000, in $1960, for armored amphibious air transportable infantry protection. That combination of capabilities at that price point was, and remains, extraordinary. Vietnam is where the M113 found its identity, and where it was both celebrated and condemned in the same battles, sometimes by the same soldiers. The war in Vietnam was unlike anything American doctrine had prepared for. The terrain was impossible: jungle, rice paddies, river deltas, mountains. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The front line was a concept that didn't apply, and the M113 was suddenly expected to perform in conditions nobody had designed it for. It adapted. The crews adapted it. In the Mekong Delta, where roads barely existed and water was everywhere, the M113 became a riverine fighting vehicle. A CAV, armored cavalry assault vehicle. Crews welded additional gun shields to the top, added M60 machine guns on the sides, turned what was supposed to be a personnel carrier into something approaching a light tank. The official designation said APC. The men who rode them called them tracks, and they fought from them the way cavalry had once fought from horses. Fast, aggressive, pushing into contact and through it. The Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963 showed both sides of the M113's nature. South Vietnamese M113s were used in an assault on a Viet Cong position. The initial attack failed, not because the vehicles were inadequate, but because the commanders hesitated to expose the expensive machines. When they finally moved, the M113s performed as designed. The battle became a case study in how doctrine and courage matter as much as equipment. In American hands throughout the mid to late 1960s, the M113 accumulated a combat record that is genuinely impressive. It moved infantry into and out of contact faster than anything else in the inventory. It crossed terrain that stopped wheeled vehicles cold. It swam the rivers that divided the country. And it absorbed an enormous amount of punishment from mines, RPGs, and small arms fire while keeping its crews alive. It also burned. The gasoline-powered early variants were vulnerable to fire in ways that the later diesel versions reduced but never entirely eliminated. Crews knew this. They rode on top when they could, outside the vehicle, exposed to small arms, because they judged the risk of being inside a burning vehicle to be worse than the risk of being shot. That calculation tells you everything about what combat really looks like. The diesel-powered M113A1, introduced in 1964, addressed the fire risk significantly. It was faster, had better range, and the diesel fuel was far less flammable than gasoline. The A1 became the definitive Vietnam-era M113, and the one that most survivors remember. After Vietnam, the M113 went everywhere. Israel used M113s in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where they performed the essential task of moving infantry under fire across the Sinai and the Golan Heights. The Israeli Defense Forces modified their vehicles extensively, as every army that operated the M113 eventually did, adding reactive armor, different weapons, improved communications. The Falklands War in 1982 saw Argentine M113s facing British forces. The Gulf War in 1991 saw American M113s supporting operations in the Iraqi desert. The wars in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq again. The M113 was there, in the hands of American forces and allies alike, doing the job it had been designed to do 3 decades earlier. And in Ukraine, right now, M113s transferred from Western countries are moving Ukrainian infantry across contested ground. A vehicle designed in the late 1950s, in a war being fought with 21st century weapons, performing its essential function, getting soldiers where they need to go, protected from the things that would kill them in the open. The number of M113 variants is almost beyond counting. Anti-tank missile carriers, mortar carriers, command vehicles, ambulances, engineer vehicles, artillery tractors, electronic warfare platforms. The basic hull has been adapted into so many configurations that entire books have been written trying to catalogue them all. More than 40 countries have operated the M113 in some form. Production ran to over 80,000 vehicles, making it one of the most produced armoured vehicles in history. How does the M113 compare to what came before it and what came after? Against the M59 it replaced, there is no comparison. The M113 is lighter, faster, amphibious without preparation, air transportable, and cheaper. The M59 was rendered obsolete overnight. Against the M2 Bradley that replaced it in American service in the 1980s, the Bradley wins on firepower, on protection, on night fighting capability. The Bradley is a fighting vehicle, not just a carrier. It has a 25mm chain gun and anti-tank missiles and can engage enemy armor directly. But the Bradley weighs over 30 tons, costs millions of dollars, cannot be transported in a C-130, and is too heavy to swim without preparation. The M113 can go places the Bradley cannot, which is why the US Army used M113s alongside Bradleys for decades after the Bradley entered service. Against modern competitors like the Russian BMP series, the BMP trades the M113's simplicity and reliability for heavier armament and slightly better protection. In a straight fight, the BMP has more firepower. In a sustained operational environment where maintenance matters, the M113's simplicity is a genuine advantage. Different philosophies, different strengths. The honest assessment is that no successor has completely replaced the M113 because no successor has replicated its combination of simplicity, reliability, cost, and versatility. The Bradley is better at many things. It is worse at being simple, cheap, and fixable by a mechanic with basic tools in a forward operating base. What is the M113's legacy? It is the proof that the best military vehicle is not always the most sophisticated. Sometimes it is the most useful. The M113 was never the most heavily armored, never the most heavily armed, never the fastest or the most technologically impressive machine in any inventory it served in. But it showed up, on every continent, in every climate, in conflicts from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the deserts of the Middle East, to the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe. It showed up, it worked, it got soldiers where they needed to go, and it brought many of them back. 80,000 vehicles, 60+ years of service, still fighting today. The M113 is the answer to the question, what does a truly successful military vehicle look like? Not the flashiest, not the most expensive. The one that works, that keeps working, that can be fixed when it breaks. That does its job in conditions nobody anticipated and keeps doing it for 6 decades. So here's the question for the comments. In an era of autonomous vehicles, drones, and electronic warfare, does the M113's philosophy still apply? Is simplicity and reliability still the right answer? Or has warfare changed so fundamentally that the M113's era is finally over? Tell me what you think. Like if you enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.